There's something of a strange conformity to be found within many of the Nintendo company's long-standing series. The first game is the Trailblazer, which sets the bar and the standards, while the second game, although appreciated in its time, eventually becomes less remembered or liked due to it being too far away from the original vision. This is the case with Super Mario Bros. 2, The Adventure of Link, and quite a few more games I could mention. The second Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem Gaiden, meaning Fire Emblem Side Story, absolutely fits right into this category. Released for the original Famicom on March 14, 1992, Fire Emblem Gaiden told the story of new heroes Alm and Celica and their intertwining adventures on the new continent of Valentia. Like its predecessor, Fire Emblem Gaiden was never released outside of Japan, and also like the previous game, it has received very complete English translations by fans, with the translation I played being much stronger and more understandable than the one for the first game. At a surface-level glance, Gaiden appears to be just like any other game in the franchise. These battles look pretty much identical, with the same overhead grid-based combat of the previous and future entries, and most of the classes are recognizable immediately. Yet, still, without a doubt, Gaiden is the black sheep of the franchise. Why is that? Any person who's played it, in addition to the others, could answer that question right away. The underlying systems and mechanics of this entry are so completely different that it gives an uncanny feeling to the entire proceedings. Many of its changes and innovations were completely disregarded when moving on to later games in the series, again, exactly like the bevy of black sheep contenders in Nintendo's catalog. This brings me to the crux of this video, and what I will be attempting to answer. If most of the systems of this game were later discarded, does that mean that Gaiden is actually bad? Or that its new systems and mechanics were simply worth forgetting? The best way to answer this, rather than listening to anybody else, is to actually play the game for yourself, front to back. To best give my own answer, I completed Gaiden twice, and in the following segments, I will explain exactly how this game expanded upon the concepts of the previous game, and what its worth as an entry in this series adds up to, starting from the actual development of the game itself. Development for the sequel to the first Fire Emblem game began after the previous title, Fire Emblem Dark Dragon and the Sword of Light, became a confirmed success in Japan. The developer, Intelligent Systems, whose track record from before was mainly in giving programming assistance to Nintendo R&D 1, finally had a strong series of its own in order to move forward with. Fire Emblem 1 writer and designer Shozo Kaga this time became the director on top of those prior roles, replacing Keisuke Terasaki. Returning as the producer was Nintendo legend Gunpei Yokoi, and returning to handle the music and sound design was Yuka Tsujiyoko. Together, these three were incredibly influential in the early days of Fire Emblem, and in what would be the first sequel to this franchise, a lot of emphasis was placed on addressing issues which the prior game carried. This manifested in sweeping changes to the inner systems, particularly targeting map navigation and item management, two areas which I think definitely needed improvements. But besides these tweaked mechanics, a much greater emphasis was also to be placed on storytelling. Kaga, in particular, wished to create a much stronger narrative than before, both in writing as well as in the ways in which it was told. This again led to sweeping changes with how the player interacted with the world. The results of their effort was Fire Emblem Gaiden, which, despite its large amount of changes to the formula established in number 1, definitely did not fail to please at the time. At release, Gaiden was positively received. Japanese critics, such as those at Famitsu, gave it a 28 out of 40, with some who played it there saying that they enjoyed it more than the first, while others called into question some design flaws, while still being positive overall. For fans, it was quite liked at the time, doing well in popularity polls and showing that the team at Intelligent Systems could consistently deliver in this franchise. However, there was definitely still room to grow. Fire Emblem Gaiden has since been released on Japan's Virtual Console multiple times. For Japanese gamers, the release of its first official remake with Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia in 2017 was a nostalgic return to the early days of the franchise. But for Western fans of the series, the tale of Alm, Celica, and the troubled land they inhabited was a fresh experience and one that brought new, interesting characters and struggles for them to experience for the first time. Looking back at the way that the story was handled in Gaiden is sure to feel a bit quaint, but compared to the first game in the series, it's a whole new level of polish. True to its moniker of Gaiden, the second Fire Emblem game is not a direct sequel to the first, although certain characters from the prior game do appear. First, a word of warning. The following story segment is going to contain full spoilers. Please keep in mind that the most recent Fire Emblem game at my time of writing is Fire Emblem Echoes, a remake of this one. As far as I know, Echoes contain some additional scenes and some things will play out rather differently, but because the events of Gaiden will surely overlap, if you want to avoid all spoilers for either game, you can jump to the timestamp that is on screen now. Also, one extra note. The names and place names I will be using come from the translation which I played. I'm using the names that anybody else who goes on to play this game using the translation I've linked in the description will see. And for when those names change in the future, I'll be making notes of the official translations for both this and Fire Emblem 1's names when I actually get to the games that use them. I hope that kind of makes sense and that we're all on the same page now, because it's time to start the story. Long before the events of the game, two gods lived in the land of Valencia, Mila and her brother Doma. Both of these gods carried certain values higher than others. The older brother Doma was obsessed with power and despised the corruption that he saw in mankind, whereas Mila valued love and peace above all else. Eventually, the disparity in their ideals led to the two gods splitting the land of Valencia in two, with the north ruled by Doma and the south ruled by Mila. As centuries passed, two kingdoms sprang up, the Doma-worshipping land of Rigel to the north, and the Mila-worshipping land of Sofia to the south. The two gods had a heavy hand in influencing their respective kingdoms, and thus the people eventually became reflections of them, with the Rigelians valuing power and the Sofians valuing peace. And, much like the gods before them, these clashing ideologies eventually led to tension. In order to avoid disaster, a pact between the two nations was made, forbidding the gods and their countries from warring. But regardless, over time, the tension continued to rise. It is in this moment of turmoil that two children were born to the separate royal families of Rigel and Sofia, who would soon find their countries engulfed in war. After some time has passed, the first chapter of Fire Emblem Gaiden begins, from the perspective of Alm, a 17-year-old man growing up under the tutelage of the knight Mycen, in the southwestern village of Ram in Sofia. Alm's friends, whom he trains with, are the local villagers Robin, Gray, and Cliff, and they have a pretty normal, peaceful life. However, this is all shattered when Luca, a soldier of the Sophian kingdom, arrives, bringing news of a sudden attack on Sofia Castle that has killed the king and seized the capital. The war, which many felt coming but was supposed to be forbidden, had finally broken out. However, in response to the sudden aggression, a Sophian liberation army had arisen, and Luca had come to the village in search of the famous General Mycen in order to have him assist them. When approached with the opportunity, Alm is surprised to find the Great Knight refuse to take any part in this fight, and naturally our hero Alm offers himself up instead. And alongside his loyal village friends and Luca, they set off together to meet up with the rest of the resistance and to take back Sofia Castle. Along the way, Alm fights through bandits and camps of Rigelian soldiers, freeing captured innocents with each step, until he is finally face to face with Clive, the leader of the Liberation Army. After Clive admits that he sent Luca to Ram in order to get Mycen to lead them, the position is instead offered to Alm in light of his recent victories, to which Alm agrees and becomes the leader of the resistance. Before setting out for the castle, Alm learns what it is that allowed this war to happen. The goddess Mila, who would have protected Sofia in the case of war, has suffered a sudden disappearance, suspiciously shortly before the Rigelian kingdom invaded and took Sofia with little resistance. With only Alm and his new army to defend the land, he launches his attack on the captured castle, and after successfully cutting through the Rigelian defenders and driving their commander General Dozer out, his liberation army succeeds in freeing the land for now. Even though he has control of the castle, Alm really has no desire to claim it for his own, and instead he sets about finding the lost princess of the now slain royal family, and to also prepare for the eventual Rigelian counterattack. With much to think about, Alm is surprised to meet Mycen in the castle, who tells him that he now accepts that Alm will have to find his own path in life, and that he knows that a certain red-haired girl who will help him will soon be arriving. As Chapter 1 of this game ends, we can already see that a lot has changed in terms of storytelling since Fire Emblem Dark Dragon, and that the story itself is also being communicated in a much clearer fashion. There are a lot of unanswered questions raised in these opening events, but for now, Chapter 2 begins as we take command of Celica, the red-haired girl whom Mycen mentioned. Celica is a priestess in a priory on the islands to the southeast of Sofia Castle. In truth, she is actually the missing princess of Sofia who had been sent away to the priory in order to protect her. Although her father father is now slain, she is reluctant to return to the castle and lead her people, and instead focuses on solving a different crisis. Celica, as a priestess of Mila, is for now more concerned with the strange disappearance of the goddess, something which her caretaker, the Bishop Noma, agrees must be looked into, as the return of the goddess can stop all further war without issue. Alongside her magic-wielding friends, Celica departs by ship, battling her own way through hordes of undead creatures roaming the land and pirate crews roaming the seas, before she finally arrives at Sophia Castle. Upon arriving, she is surprised to find her former caretaker, Knight Myson, there, and that the castle had already been liberated by a local hero, someone whom she had been very close to in the past. Alm and Celica had once been both under the care of Myson, before he was forced to send the secret princess away in order to protect her from a plot to kill off the Sophian royal children before the oncoming invasion by Rigel. Myson now sends Celica to speak with Alm, and the two are happy to reunite after many years apart. While it is clear that the two care for each other, destiny pulls them apart yet again, as Alm has become convinced that the only response to the recent attacks is to retaliate against the North, while Celica instead focuses on her original target of bringing peace through the return of the goddess Mila. With Alm still unaware that the missing princess that he's seeking is actually his childhood friend, Chapter 3 begins as the two depart Sophia Castle, and for the first time, the player can continue their two stories simultaneously. Alm's goal takes him west to Dozer's Fort, while Celica heads east to the Temple of Mila. At Dozer's Fort, Alm manages to catch up to and slay the slimy General Dozer, retrieving a legendary sword which Dozer had stolen from the castle, which Alm mysteriously is able to wield, despite it being enchanted to prevent anyone except for those with the royal blood from using it. At the same time as this, Celica liberates a captured priestess of Mila from the leader of the pirate gang whom she had been fighting back at sea. This priestess gives her a royal circlet which proves her identity and her true name, as the Princess Antaise of Sophia. Back to the west, Alm next leads an attack on the Sluice Gate, which the Regelians are attempting to keep closed in order to flood the land of Sophia. After defeating the Domo-worshipping Arcanist Tartara, from whom he is able to rescue a new ally from mind control, he finds the Sluice Gate still stuck, as it cannot be operated without cooperation from a second one at Mila's temple. Fortunately, Celica had just then arrived at the temple, and after freeing it from the dark shamans of Doma who had taken it over, she finally learns the fate of the goddess Mila. Shortly before the invasion, the dark god Doma had given King Rudolf of Rigel a special sword called the Falchion, a blade which was capable of sealing away a god. After an attack on Mila's temple by the king himself, the goddess had been sealed away into the blade, and the blade had then been given to the high priest of Doma, Jeddah, who sealed it beneath his tower to the north. With both Alm and Celica now needing to head further north, both gates are activated, which lowers the river and allows both of them to continue forth as Chapter 4 begins. Like in the previous chapter, players are given control of both Alm and Celica simultaneously, with Alm's side of the adventure seeing him cut through even more enemies' forces before arriving at the infamous Dragon Mountain. Atop this mountain, Alm is suddenly trapped when both ways of escape are cut off, leaving him and his soldiers to endlessly fend off the undead creatures which live atop it. With Alm in mortal peril, to the northeast, Celica arrives at the Tower of Doma, and confronts Jeddah, who instead of attacking, shows her a vision of Alm struggling to his death atop the mountain. He offers her a deal. He will use his magic to free Alm, but only if Celica allows herself and her friends to be sacrificed to Doma. Celica, who of course is in love with Alm, ultimately agrees, and surprisingly, Jeddah remains true to his word. He next takes Celica and her companions to the altar of Doma below, where they are to be slowly sacrificed, feasting the dark god Doma with their pain and misery. With Alm's way ahead cleared, he heads forth, cutting through the last of the Regelian defenders before arriving at the castle. After a long battle, he finally penetrates the castle's defenses, but he's surprised to find that the king refuses to attack him, and instead allows himself to be defeated. When the killing blow is landed on Rudolf, the king gives one last confession before his passing. Over time, the dark god Doma, who had once treasured power and despised corruption, began to lose his mind, something which also led the nation of Rigel into madness. In order to protect his son, King Rudolf had sent him away under the care of Knight Myson, whom he hoped could raise him into the kind of warrior who could eventually become powerful enough to stop Doma. As you might expect, Alm is secretly the king's own son, Albion Alm Rudolf. And before the king passes away, he urges Alm to recover the Falchion, which rests in a passageway between the castle and Doma's tower, and use it to defeat the dark god at last. With the king's death, Alm is now the ruler of Rigel, and Chapter 5 begins. In order to fulfill his father's last wish, Alm, who is now joined by Mycen, uses the underground passageway, and after a difficult test, he recovers the falchion. Taking it with him, Alm is able to arrive in time to discover Celica and her group still undergoing their torment by the servants of Doma. In a climactic final battle, Alm and Celica, together again at last, are able to rally their combined forces, slay the High Priest Jeddah, and use the falchion to steal away Doma in the same way that the goddess Mila had been. With his last words, the god Doma passes on the land of Valencia to Alm, urging him to rule fairly with both his power and Mila's love. Following the war, Alm and Celica marry, and the lands of Rigel and Sofia are at last combined into the single kingdom of Valencia, and so begins a long and prosperous rule, the rule of the Holy King Alm I and of the Queen Celica. One of the greatest benefits of playing games in release order is how one is able to see exactly how a series is actually growing and improving without the knowledge of later games getting in the way. If one of Shozo Kaga's biggest priorities going from the first game to the second was connecting players more to the characters in the game while crafting a better narrative, then it's easy for me to say that what was delivered here was an unprecedented success. This is one of those rare, all-time great leaps up in production quality, and even though we aren't quite there in terms of developing each individual soldier on the field, there's no doubt that the tale of Alm, Celica, and the fate of Valencia is a much more engrossing story than what had been seen previously. In just about every regard, the storytelling has been improved. And my favorite way that he did this was something that I believe a lot of stories, especially game stories, can benefit from: scaling things down. Even though Fire Emblem 1 and 2 both concern themselves in the affairs of spunky young heroes leading liberation armies against an overwhelming invading force, the land of Valencia is much better characterized than the land of Arcania. Even though Marth visits a total of 9 kingdoms across his game, there really isn't much to say about the actual culture of the people in each land that he liberates. About the most we got there was that this is the place where the mages are, or there are lots of dragons here. I'm not trying to say that the plot of Gaiden is anything special, especially compared to games of today, or I'm assuming later Fire Emblem games. But what it really did, which was significant, was that it brought the series into step with other RPGs of its time. The stories of the early Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games were nothing to write home about, but they gave the necessary context for what you were doing and explained themselves well, and that's part of what gave them such a lasting appeal. Even without glancing at any explanations afterwards, I could have told you the story of Fire Emblem Gaiden from playing it, and that is significant because the first game left me scratching my head the entire time. It may seem like an obvious feature of any RPG, but the fact that this game has a world map alone does a lot to give players a sense of progress and place. Even with 2 protagonists, mapping out the adventures of Alm and Celica versus Marth does a good job on its own of showing just how much more coherent this adventure is. Again, it isn't all perfect, just a huge step in the right direction. While the number of characters with actual personalities and development has increased, the majority of the cast of the game still consists of generic fighters, with their only individual features being a single unique portrait and some ending text in the credits. We are still far away from support conversations and quirky character writing for everyone in the cast, but characters like Alm, Celica, Mycen, King Rudolph, and the gods Mila and Doma are not ones that I'm going to forget anytime soon. All in all, I had a fantastic time experiencing the story, partly because I could actually understand it, but mostly because it does successfully use theming and some subtext to craft an interesting series of events for 2 likable yet very different leads. However, while the storytelling of this game is a remarkable leap forward in quality, the changes in the mechanics and gameplay make for a much more complicated picture. In the very first Fire Emblem game, director Keisuke Tedasaki and his team managed to successfully set the groundwork for every game in the series thereafter. Comparing the first game in this franchise to the very latest shows a clear adherence to the same grid-based strategy-oriented mechanics for the last 30 years, something which holds true even if you do this with some of the 3D console entries, or gameplay from the first Fire Emblem for Nintendo Switch, Three Houses. Very few other game series as old as Fire Emblem can show such a correlation, even taking a look at Breath of the Wild, which was absolutely meant to be a return back to the design priorities of the very first Zelda, shows at a glance how the ways that the player interacts with the game game has become orders of magnitude more complicated. That simply isn't the case with Fire Emblem. Every game in the franchise controls in the same basic way, and advances in hardware mostly just increase the gameplay speed and the quality in presenting the story. What differs with each entry here are the inner mechanics. In other words, it isn't the frame, but the engine that changes each time. And it is within this context that the ways in which Gaiden differs from the rest of the series has forever given it the title as the Black Sheep Fire Emblem game. When the director's chair passed over to Shozo Kaga, he set out not only to more effectively bond players to the characters through storytelling, but to also place an even bigger priority on addressing issues with gameplay in order to make Gaiden a much more pleasurable experience. To say that some of these changes were sweeping would be to undersell it. Under the titular premise of this game being a Gaiden, Kaga and his team felt safe changing things up quite dramatically, using not a scalpel but a sword in order to fix systems which were not meeting their expectations in the prior entry. In my last retrospective, I mentioned that although the first Fire Emblem game was a good old-school strategic experience under the hood, the speed at which it played made it a tedious chore which could hardly be tolerated, especially given the length and difficulty. It certainly was not lost on the team at Intelligent Systems that they had made an incredibly complex, unenjoyable experience, and almost all the mechanical changes made in Gaiden seem laser-focused on improving the tedium found in normal play. So, if you watched the last video, there's something that you might be asking. Does this entry still play as intolerably slowly as the last game? Well, the answer is no, but in the context of our modern expectations of the speed at which strategy games, and especially Fire Emblem games, should play, it is still pretty slow. Almost everything in this video is going to be the sped up footage at which I actually played the game. On my first playthrough, I made it into Celica's chapter until I chose to speed things up, mainly due to this ridiculously slow animation. Again, I'm going to recommend modern players to speed up the game to whatever level you feel comfortable. And unfortunately, again, doing this will spoil the great soundtrack. At the very least, this is the last time I'm going to have to make this recommendation, because from here on out, the rate at which the games play becomes much better. Even though the Famicom technology limited the team in speeding up the gameplay, it's easy to see that in every other way, the team was doing their best to remove the other issues which turned the first game into a tedious chore. First of all, the item management nightmare that was one of Fire Emblem Dark Dragon's sorest spots is simply non-existent in Gaiden. There are no shops in the world, and in fact, you never earn currency of any kind. Although there is now an overworld to navigate, this is purely to get from battle to battle, and to allow you to visit some consistent locations for speaking to NPCs or grinding dungeons. When it comes to your individual soldiers, there are no item or weapon slots to even think about. In the previous game, all characters had 4 slots to fill with either items or weapons, and on top of this, most objects, be it sword, tome, or key, would degrade as you used them, with them eventually breaking forever when used enough. This kind of system was perfectly fine. However, the trouble came with trying to manage so many individual inventories, which completely lacked a central form of storage. In short, the inventory system was severely in need of reworking. Unfortunately, Gaiden's answer was to just cut it. Now, other than a single special item slot for each character, nobody has or needs an inventory. Instead, each character is already holding a weapon befitting their class, which will simply never break. There are no decisions to make between using swords or shields, or making spaces for healing items or keys, and there's also no way to upgrade. The replacement of this system is kind of a double-edged sword. While making ridiculous digital queue lines at shops is a thing of the past, which is a good thing, this also means that there's less preparation and strategy to think about outside of just how to kill things. It's kinda hard not to feel mixed on this simpler system, especially when some parts of it show signs that the team was halfway to getting the original inventory system perfected anyway. As I mentioned, all characters have one and only one space for special items. This space is used to hold a number of different kinds of items, like weapons or shields or rings. They all will use the same spot. The best way I can demonstrate how this works is like this. Let's take a standard archer as an example, which in Gaiden has an attack range of 2, which means that he can happily fire arrows in that range all that he likes, because his default bow will never break. Certain enemies in this game might drop a special bow item, which can be given to our archer, taking up his single special equipment slot. Special weapons like this also do not have durability, and what it will do is massively increase his range and damage at the cost of reducing his speed. Our archer can still do what he could do before, but he's just upgraded with lower speed. This isn't his only option, as putting other items in the slot will benefit him in a couple different ways, like a shield giving him increased defense, or a ring which could give him healing each turn or extra luck. He can't use special swords or spears, but of course, other units can. Just like in the previous game, soldiers can pass or exchange items that are in this special slot. And thank God there is also a way to manage these items outside of the battle as well, working exactly as you might expect. This might not seem like a big deal to you, but for anyone who has struggled through the original game, and I have, I gotta tell you, this is a really big deal. It doesn't even end here though. Given that this game has two protagonists who each create their own separate armies, who therefore can't easily exchange items, Gaiden thoughtfully has special NPCs found in a variety of locations in the game world, which allow you to send any of these special items on one-way trips between Celica's group or Alm's group. Here's a pro tip, by the way. Send the angel ring that Celica's group can pick up to Alm's group before going on to her last battle in Chapter 4. Believe me, you'll thank me later. The fact that these trade NPCs were even thought of being put into the game definitely shows the huge amount of self-awareness that the developers had when it came to acknowledging the former game's flaws. It's not a perfect solution, but without a doubt, they are hitting on the right idea. I'm not so sure that everyone will have the same feeling when it comes to the magic system. Rather than the mages in this game casting spells from magical tomes in their inventory, for the first and I believe only time in the Fire Emblem series, magic users learn new spells by gaining levels, and rather than being limited in castings by the remaining durability on their tomes, mages are limited instead by each spell costing health in order to cast. This may sound like a bizarre system, and admittedly it kind of is, but it isn't a design which goes wholly against the gameplay priorities of the series, and in fact it kind of fits extremely well into this game's overall mechanics. Each of the two main characters' journeys in this game are remarkably different, with Alm's battles being the more militaristic soldier-on-soldier combat, and Celica's being more against monsters using an assortment of magic users. As each of her allies uses up bits of their own life in order to burn the abominations before them, Fire Emblem Gaiden does a great job at teaching one of its core strategies, which all players of the series need to learn, especially new players, and that is the importance of positioning. In my first playthrough of Fire Emblem Dark Dragon, the first game, I was able to get through most of the early battles by just advancing carefully, letting most of my enemies come to me themselves and then dogpiling on them repeatedly until I won. This was a strategy which worked for me until the battle at Port Warren, where the rush of the overwhelming horde of enemies had me getting wrecked with this previous strategy. The solution to that situation was to stop thinking about each member of my army as an individual soldier, but instead as just one piece of a formation of soldiers which could be altered as necessary. Think about it like this. If 4 enemies are advancing on your front lines, any ally that is not standing next to another is able to be attacked a maximum number of 4 times per turn. Given that most units, even some of the strongest ones in the game, cannot last being attacked twice or 3 times consecutively, leaving any soldier in such a position during an enemy's turn is suicide. However, by positioning an ally next to the previous unit, you are already lowering the number of times that they can be attacked. As you continue to spread your units out connected to each other, even in just a simple line formation like this, you're not only reducing the number of directions from which they can be attacked, but increasing the real estate of space that your troops are inhabiting on the battlefield, which forces your enemies to get around them if they want to attack any person more than once. This is exacerbated when you're using your formations in tandem with each map's landscapes and choke points. These are just the basics of area defense in a 2D grid map, and if you're familiar with the board game Go, these are the exact kinds of concepts that beginner players of that game must learn. And realistically, it's really just coming to understand how the surface area around a single piece on a grid changes simply by placing it next to another. It seems like simple stuff, but for new players, it's an important skill to learn, and the lessons that you learn in positioning take an even higher priority in the second Fire Emblem game. Early on in Chapter 2, when Celica departs her island by boat, she finds herself under attack by pirates. Even though battles like this ship one will quickly wear out their welcome due to their eventual overuse, in these early pirate battles, the abundance of ranged attackers on Celica's side makes the solution to this battle especially clear. You need to choke the point with someone who can take some hits, and get your ranged users in positions where they can all blast the boarding party apart. Due to your magic users having health loss from each time that they attack, you really cannot afford to let them be vulnerable. And the best way to ensure that they are not attacked after they use some magic is to use your formations to limit the enemy's movement and attacking potential. In other words, this is a level which teaches the basics of positioning in a Fire Emblem game much less punishingly than the Port Warren chapter. Good positioning and creating formations are skills which will last the player throughout the entire game, just becoming more complicated or flexible as each player becomes more confident in their learning of the AI systems and of their own limits. I actually do kind of like the health for magic system, if only for just how much it prioritizes positioning alone. It's a clever system of risk and reward, even if it is just exaggerating the vulnerabilities of casters to an extreme level in order to make its point. Many other great design decisions abound in Gaiden, at the same time sitting shoulder to shoulder with its massive blunders. Take, for example, the new auto-command system. At any point in your turn, you can select one of these, which orders all of your remaining units to use their turn doing some kind of simple action, like going on the assault towards the nearest enemy, or simply gathering up around either Alm or Celica. These commands can cut out huge amounts of wasted time. However, the assault command is of very limited use, and can very easily change from being an efficient time saver to just a suicide button. Using this command will have all of your units who haven't used their turn yet attack whoever is closest, which ignores the all-important sense of self-preservation that this game requires. This is especially deadly with high mobility characters like Pegasus Knights, who are glass cannons whose every move has to be carefully considered in order to keep them from being caught out and slain. The gather command, on the other hand, is one that I use constantly, and it really was a godsend, cutting out on a lot of the busy work of just moving units where I would want them to be anyway. But the fact that it is sitting right next to an option that can lose you the entire battle if you press it accidentally is a bit worrying to say the least. Next up, on the enemy side, surprise reinforcements are no longer a thing. There are no forts to capture or surprises to worry about in the battles, something which cuts down on 100% of the frustrating, unforeseeable deaths that the first game could penalize you with. While you might think that this makes the battles less tense, which it kind of does, this mechanic is actually just replaced by the addition of a new enemy type, the Shaman. In the battles where they appear, enemy shamans can continually call in near-endless hordes of monsters, ranging from weak, shambling zombies to undead dragons with a crazy amount of mobility. There are a lot of brilliant changes here that make this a much more preferred system of adding in dynamic enemy reinforcements to a battle, simply from the number of balancing features which are included. For one, the monsters the shaman summons cannot attack on the turn that they appear, which gives you a chance to move an ally that may not have been in the best position before you were surprised. Secondly, healers on your side will eventually gain the ability to summon in shadow soldiers in a similar manner, who seem to be designed in order to draw enemy aggro, which can be an effective counter against a big horde of enemy summoned monsters. There is a downside to this, as one healer gains the ability to call in slayers, also called dread fighters, which can turn some of the strategy of the mid-game battles into simply pressing the ninja button in order to just let you win. Thirdly, there is also a spell for healers which can de-summon all but one or two of the enemy shaman's creatures. There are definitely drawbacks to each of these balancing mechanics, and none of them are really that well polished, but the fact that there are responses to these enemy reinforcements, and that you won't just suddenly be put in an awful position, is what makes all the difference here. Something that I like way less is what it takes to actually kill a shaman once you've reached them, which brings me to what is perhaps this game's most ridiculous excess in design, the terrain bonus system. If you don't understand what I mean by terrain bonus system, in a nutshell, the kind of land that a unit is standing on will typically add to their evasiveness when they're attacked. In Fire Emblem 1, the strongest terrain evasion bonus that one could get was from standing on a castle or open water, both of which were unlikely events by the way, but it did give you an extra 30% chance to dodge. This is a strong defensive bonus, to be sure, but it's definitely one that could be dealt with, and it wasn't always a sure thing if you were trying to defend your units. In Gaiden, however, these evasion numbers are supercharged. Found in every map are certain pink squares which not only recover health each turn to those standing on them, but also, for no reason that I can think of, give them an extra 40% to their evasiveness. Keep in mind that these are on every single map. If random healing squares, which made you more secure than standing on a castle, wasn't enough, these gravestones, which are found in the undead battles throughout Celica's adventure, give an absolutely absurd 60% bonus. These and the other terrain types, which give greater evade bonuses across the board, start to look really ugly when combined with certain units, like either the shamans mentioned above, dread fighters who already have great evasion and magic resistance, and other types of long-range units like archers. Shamans in particular will almost always be camped on one of these recovery points, and they have no reason to move either. They're just going to be there summoning in their own endless army, defending themselves with ranged spells, dodging most hits that come their way, and healing off any chip damage that does connect. The extra high evasion in this game can become incredibly frustrating, and can also lead to some very ridiculous looking situations, such as this time when it took 17 of my soldiers just to bring down one unfortunately located Dreadfighter, due to a combination of excessive evasion and resistances. Now, I've had to kind of go up and down in these gameplay sections, which will just add further complication to my original question. Does this game actually hold up or not? Are its innovations worthwhile or not? Let's simplify this down. When you come to understand what Shozo Kaga and his team's design intentions were with this game, almost every bizarre system introduced here kind of makes sense. Personally, I do see a lot of promise in the systems that were implemented, and I actually kind of adore a good amount of them. Other Fire Emblem players looking back on Gaiden after seeing how the later games turned out will probably be less charitable than I am, which to be honest is kind of fair. If the one word that best described Fire Emblem 1's gameplay was tedious, then the word that best describes Gaiden's would be sloppy. The developers were sloppy when they dug out old systems and slammed new ones in their place. They were sloppy when deciding on the final numbers, which would define things like range, resistances, and especially evasion. I have to admit that it wasn't skillfully put together, and yet, despite everyone and their mother trying to warn me away from this entry, at the end of the day, I still kind of loved the experience of playing this game. Far, far more than I would have expected. I can easily admit that the way that Fire Emblem Gaiden handled trying to improve on the former game was not a healthy way to handle developing the sequel. Maybe this was due to the change in director, but the product at the end of the day seems like it was a bit too willing to throw out the old and bring in the new. Like they were taking the Gaiden moniker a bit too literally, and felt like they absolutely had to alter everything under the hood in order for it to qualify as a side story. Without a doubt, Fire Emblem Gaiden has earned its black sheep status, but I want to stress, this alone doesn't make it a bad game. It truly does have some brilliant ideas and good intentions, which makes it such a shame that nowadays it's so easily disregarded. As far as I'm concerned, this is a much better starting point for anyone seeking one of the oldest Fire Emblem games to jump into the series with. I don't have to say that you have to be dedicated in order to see it to the end like I did in the last video, when all that I'm doing here right now is just recommending a game that is a bit annoyingly weird in parts, but still shamelessly fun to play. After journeying our way through the anomaly of the series that was Gaiden, our next stop on the Fire Emblem Retrospective is going to be a familiar one. As the series steps into the 16-bit generation for the first time, we are about to return to the shoes of the heroic Marth for 2 adventures in one in Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem for the Super Famicom. I hope to see you there, and as always, thank you for watching.